So now let's get today kicked off with our incredible keynote speaker, Rochelle Callander. She came in all the way from Australia. I think she's still awake. I hope she's still awake. And I would not be possible to have her here without the help of our sponsor, Satellos Bioscience. So I'd like to bring up Ryan Mitchell, PhD, the Senior VP of Medical and Scientific Affairs at Satellos, to come up and say a few words about Rachel. Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I have been afforded a few minutes to talk about Satellos, but that is not the reason you came here on time this morning, so I will be brief, and I'll encourage you to come find me. I'll be here throughout the day. Come find me at lunchtime if you want to learn more about Satellos. What I will say is that we are developing a drug called SAT-3247. This is an oral medication designed to enhance the body's natural capacity to repair and regenerate skeletal muscle. We have completed our initial clinical work in phase 1 trials, safe, tolerable profile. We've treated 5 patients, adult patients with Duchenne, have seen continuance of that safe and tolerable profile with some signs of encouraging efficacy. That trial is now continuing into a long-term follow-up. There will be hopefully all 5 of those individuals coming back. We're looking to expand that trial. And we have also submitted global regulatory filings for a phase 2 trial. You may have noticed that Canada was not in the original announcement, but I'm happy to tell you that we are working with CHIO to get a Canadian site activated. Hasn't happened yet, but we are doing everything that we can, so please don't feel like we left Canada behind. It's just an issue of timing. So without further ado, Rochelle Callander is here today. I have taken a sneak peek at her TEDx talk, so I may have cheated a little bit, and I'm telling you we're in for something special. Rochelle is an international speaker, an author. She is a communication consultant, and she has transformed how clinicians engage with patients and family. Rochelle's work is inspired by her daughter, Evie, who was born with a rare chromosomal condition, and a journey that gave Rochelle deep insight into the power of language and compassion in healthcare. With a background in fine arts and award-winning photography, she combines storytelling, creativity, and lived experience to help healthcare professionals connect with empathy and humanity. Her internationally recognized Superpower Baby project celebrates the beauty and strength of children living with rare diagnoses. Today, she works with hospitals, universities, and health organizations across the globe to cultivate trust, compassion, and understanding in healthcare communication. So please give a warm welcome for Rochelle.
Thank you so much, Satellos, for being responsible for bringing me here. I so appreciate it. It's just wonderful, and thank you, Defeat Duchenne Canada. It's such a privilege to feel like I'm among family. You've been talking about that word a lot over the last couple of days, and it really does feel like a family and a community. Alrighty, I'm going to get straight into this. From yesterday, I learned you have to kind of hold your tongue strange. Here we go. So my name is Rachel Callander, and I'm joining you from Australia. But what I wanted to share is a little bit of my story in the hopes that it can resonate with you in your own lives and your own stories. And I think none of us expected to be where we are right now. You can't plan for these things. But there is power in, I guess, transforming what happens to you. And hopefully this is encouraging for you all. I grew up in New Zealand, and I always wanted to be an artist. That was my big dream when I was a young child. And I went to university after I finished high school, and I studied photography. I was always interested in photography, and it was fascinating as I was creating my work. It didn't matter what medium I was working with. I found that all of my work was based around a similar theme, and that was the theme of finding and seeing beauty in unexpected places, or noticing the often overlooked parts of the world. And so I would photograph dying flowers or little feathers on muddy puddles and find treasures in them and elevate them through my artistic practice. And my friends and family would say, "Rachel, are you going to be a wedding photographer when you graduate?" And I just said, "No, I'm going to be a real artist. And and I ended up photographing my cousin's wedding, and this was still in the days of film. And to my horror, I found that as I was photographing his wedding, I had the best time ever, and I loved it so much that when I graduated, I started my very own wedding and portrait photography business. And I named this business Callander Girl Photography, which I thought was quite clever of me, given my last name. Thank you, I appreciate that support. And soon after I had started my little business, another business opened up just a block away from my business, quite different from the business that I had set up. And this was before websites and things, so it was Yellow Pages. I don't know if you have the Yellow Pages in Canada. So I found myself the recipient of some very strange, very late night inappropriate phone calls of people getting the wrong end of the stick, essentially, and asking me for services I was very much not willing to provide. But all of that aside, I loved my life as a wedding photographer. I loved capturing people. I loved capturing the crazy, beautiful chaos of the day, the beautiful moments, the history, the connection, and everything in between. And I felt a little bit like a rock star, to be honest. I was being flown all over New Zealand, even to Australia and Fiji, to photograph this day in a family's life, and it was all very exciting. And then I found out I was pregnant. And this was not the plan. This was not my plan at all. I actually didn't really like children. Didn't think that I was suitable to be a parent. My personality, I didn't think suited parenthood. I don't really like systems or structure. I quite like freedom and flexibility, and so this was very, very, very bad news for me, finding out I was pregnant. And so I made my husband stay home from work that day, and I said, look, you can't go to work. So he called in and he said, look, I can't go to work. There's been a family emergency, which is what this felt like. I was just not ready for this new life. It just didn't feel like it was what I was capable of being, a parent. And then at the 20-week scan, everything kind of changed. And I was very young. I was only 25, newly married, feeling like my rock star wedding photography days were all but over. But this sonographer, she picked up that this little bundle of impending doom had a little kidney issue. And this tiny little kidney wasn't draining properly, and she picked that up. And she said, look, we've found out that this baby is a girl. And so I started to lean into that and visualize what life might look like. And she said, and we'll just keep an eye on you with this little kidney problem. She might need some surgery when she's born, but look, we've got you. Everything's going to be okay. And so I went through the rest of my pregnancy starting to feel a little bit better about what was coming. And then on the 30th of March, 2008, Evie Amor Callander was born by cesarean, and the first time I saw her little face, all of my fears about being a mum just melted completely, and I fell completely head over heels in love with this beautiful little being who I saw was just full of potential, and she was just gorgeous and so cute and so tiny. And we tried to feed her, and she was a lot smaller than anyone was expecting. And we tried to feed her, and she couldn't latch. She was really tiny, and so we fed her by syringe, and she just kind of choked and then vomited and stopped breathing. And so the nurse just grabbed her out of my arms and then ran out the door. And I was recovering from a cesarean, so I couldn't move, I couldn't walk, I couldn't really do anything. And I had no idea where they'd taken Evie, because the NICU ward was a whole floor above where I was recovering. So there was this physical separation, but I didn't even know what was going on. No one could tell me what was happening. And I spent a very lonely, very terrified night by myself in this hospital. And my morphine drip had a kink in it, so I was pushing this button and there was no pain relief. And the nurse, I think she thought maybe I was a drug seeker, and it was just all a bit horrible, and I didn't know what to do. And it was all very, very stressful and traumatizing. And it was in that space the next morning when the midwife and a pediatrician came to see us, and they said, look, we've done some tests on Evie overnight and we're really concerned about her. We think she has a chromosomal condition that's incompatible with life. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, that sounds really serious. Like, is she okay? Like, what's going on? Incompatible with life, that's really bad. And they said, look, we think she has Edwards syndrome or trisomy 18. And if she does survive, which is highly unlikely. She will have severe mental retardation. She has congenital defects. She has multiple ventricular septal defects. And she has these congenital abnormalities. And I just remember thinking, are they describing the child that I just met yesterday? Because these words don't feel human, abnormal and defective and incompatible and retarded. And on this diagnosis was such a shock. But I just remember thinking, I can't even wrap my head around what's happening right now. And as you can see in these images, life with Evie was really quite challenging, and we had lots of moments where she was incredibly fragile and her life was at risk, and she hung in the balance, and we're often flown to hospitals and all the rest of it, as you guys all probably know what it's like. But every time she went through an episode like this, a scary episode, she just kind of came out just a bit stronger. And she had a resilience about her and just this tenacity in her fragile little body. And she drew out a mother in me I never knew existed, a person in me I never knew existed, like somebody who was capable of navigating these very hard, significant circumstances, someone who was courageous and strong and brave, and I never knew I had that capability until you have to. You never know how strong you are until you have to be, right? And then she just started to flourish. And it's in these photos, she's around 2 years old, and it was at this point in her life that I started to notice that she was experiencing the world a little differently to other people. So every time we drove on a particular piece of road to visit my family, we had to drive under electrical pylons. And every time we came up to these pylons, she'd start crying, and then she'd stop crying once we'd driven under them. And it happened at night time, and sometimes it woke her up, and I kept thinking, what is it about this piece of road that Evie just does not like? And then I noticed it was happening in supermarkets or anywhere we had to go through electric sliding doors. And I thought, maybe she's got like a electromagnetic sensitivity. Maybe she can feel the magnetic fields and she doesn't like it. She's like a baby Magneto of X-Men. And so I started saying that she had superpowers as a light-hearted way to describe this phenomenon of Evie. And then when I thought about her and her character and all the things that she was teaching me, I realized there was so much about her that could be celebrated and that was unique, and that all of the things about her could be considered superpowers. Like the way she had this most infectious giggle and laugh. Like she never said a single word except ooh. But I knew what that ooh meant. We could communicate without language. She loved games. She loved being on a beanbag. She had this fragility yet pure joy that just drew people towards her. And so all of these things became her superpowers, and it became a way for me to talk about her. Because what was often happening at the time was I would take Evie into town. We would go on errands together. And the first thing someone would ask me when they saw Evie was, "What's wrong with your child? What's wrong with her? What's wrong?" And initially I'd brace myself and I'd say, well, she has partial trisomy 9 and partial monosomy 6 and multiple ventricular septal defects. You can't even say that word, it's so hard. And she can't walk and she can't talk and the blah, 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 blah. All of the diagnosis words. And that poor stranger just kind of glazed over and then walked away. And I felt this chasm of fear open up between us. And I started to get angry. I thought, oh, that stupid person, why do I have to answer these stupid questions? And I don't like this, and I wish I'd just kept Evie at home. It would have been easier, and I was all angry and upset. But with my language of superpowers, the next time someone asked me, what's wrong with your child? That's not how they asked, but that's how I interpret it in my head. What's wrong with your child? I said, nothing. Nothing's wrong with her. Actually, she has superpowers. And they kind of looked at me a bit strange. And they said, what do you mean? And then I got to reframe that entire conversation about all of the things that I loved about Evie. All of the things that she could do, all of the things that she was interested in, how much we had so much fun in our lives, how free life was, how I could kind of throw away the rule book and we could just exist in each moment. And then they looked at her again and they said, oh, isn't she so cute? Look at those cute little fingers and those big sparkly eyes. What a little honey. And I say, yeah, I really love being Evie's mum. It is such a joy. She's just the best little human ever. And in that moment, because I had described a human being, that stranger saw a human being rather than a collection of failing body parts and something to be afraid of. And they leaned in with a sense of curiosity and they asked me more about Evie, and I got to talk about her how every other parent gets to talk about their children, all of the things that they love about their children. And it was just a simple, oopsies, no, oh, okay, don't look, close your eyes. But, you know, despite this sense of empowerment in my newfound language, I was constantly forced into a space of feeling hopeless and disempowered, and it was often through the medical system. And you guys will know about this, IEP forms, or needs assessment documents, or anything that you have to put a tick beside, you know, anything that measures your child against normal, essentially. And I remember our healthcare team came to me with a needs assessment document, you know, which is great. It establishes what your child might need. But I remember I couldn't tick a single question on this 2-page document, and it just broke me. It broke my heart and it broke my spirit, because I thought the person at the other end, when they receive this blank document with no ticks, that they'd think that here is a child that has no value. This child can't do anything. What's the point, you know? And I hated that. There was nowhere on that form that celebrated her life or her abilities, or showed that person at the other end how well she was loved and how much she was changing her community. And so I said, look, I don't want to hand in this form. This just sucks. All these questions are dumb. I don't want to fill this out. And they said, well, you kind of should. You might get some support. And I thought, well, all right, then I'll hand it in, but only if I can also hand in my own document. And they looked at me a bit strange. And so what I did was I opened up my computer, I created a new Word document, and I called it Evie's Awesomeness. And I created a list of questions about Evie that I could already answer yes to, and put big ticks beside because she was already doing the things that I was asking of her. And over the years, it's had a few design zhuzh updates, and so it looks quite fancy these days. And as you might be able to see, some of the questions are quite strange, but I'm going to read a few out to you because you'll get a sense of Evie and who she was. The first question, can your child play Sleeping Tiger and other great games? Yes, big tick. This was a game that Evie and I actually made up together, and if anyone wants to know the rules, I will tell you in the breaks. Does your child laugh when objects fall near her face? Yes, who knows why, but it was something that she loved. And I'll read you one more, the last one. Can your child do assisted pull-ups holding her head up? Yes. And Evie does this very well, using her dad to help her, and her record is 13 in a row. What a superstar. Go, Evie. And I just remember this little piece of paper at the time making me feel so excited and such a sense of joy, because I could see that Evie was growing and developing in her own way. And while it might not be registered on any official document, this piece of paper became her measuring stick, and I was measuring her against herself. And she was doing brilliantly when I measured her against herself. And I think so often we're measuring against normal, and that's when we exclude so many people, because it's such a narrow way of looking at the world. What if we could stretch our idea of normal out to as far to the edges as possible? How much more inclusion and acceptance there would be in the world. And these slides are a bit horrible to look at, but basically it's just the idea of reframing some of this stuff into our language. So the slide on the left is from a woman who put this on Instagram, actually. She has a little son with kinetic cerebral palsy, and the first paragraph she read from this neuro summary was this clinician celebrating her child's beautiful characteristics. And so you get the sense that when she's reading what comes next, she's in a space where she's feeling seen, and she's feeling like her child has been seen. And it puts her in a better emotional state to read whatever comes next on that official document. And then the slide on the right there is a speech and language therapist in New Zealand who's making awesomeness reports. So every time she meets with a family, she's asking questions about the child and what the child loves doing, and new things that the child is interested in. And those things are written in the official document as important and as any medical or therapeutic treatment that's happening. And so this therapist is saying, since making awesomeness reports, she loves her job more because she feels like she's making more of a difference, because she's connecting with the families trust her, and she can actually be more useful, and it connects her to why she became a speech and language therapist in the first place. So it's just these simple ideas of seeing each other as human and understanding that we can do things a little bit differently. Sadly, though, Evie's life wasn't a long one, but for every single day for 2.5 years of her life, she was completely compatible with life. It just wasn't for as long as we had hoped. But in her short, remarkable life, she inspired a dream, which has become her legacy, and which is why I'm here in Toronto talking to you beautiful people about the impact that our children have. And so in my capacity as a photographer, I wanted to travel New Zealand and find other children like Evie who had superpowers potentially, and whose beautiful abilities were going unnoticed and overlooked in the world. And so I traveled around and I met 75 families, and I made Superpower Baby Project, and it's a beautiful photographic art book full of these gorgeous children and all of their superpowers and all the things that make them unique. And then more recently, in Western Australia, Superpower Kids is the follow-up initiative. And I can see there are some tears in the room, so I'm quite scared to tell you what's coming next, actually, because I want to show you a slideshow of the pictures that feature in these books. And I encourage you to really see the joy in the photographs and lean into your emotion, but look after yourself at the same time. I know it's a lot to hold, but we're in this together. You understand this more than anyone, so please enjoy these beautiful children. out there? Is everyone all right? Yeah.
Hello, hello.
Well, what did you see in those photographs? If you feel comfortable, yell out some words. What did you see? Joy. Okay, you passed. That was a secret test. That's the first thing that everyone yells back at me. They see joy. What else did you see? Beauty. Yes. Yeah. Uniqueness. Yeah, I love that. Love. Yeah. These kids were so cheeky and so fun and so full of life and energy and ability and just their gorgeous childness, essentially. But those words, and again, when I was interviewing the families, they used big words like this as well to describe the impact their children were having on them. You know, they have resilience, they're learning tenacity. It's really hard. It's really hard. But they love their children so much. But these words that I've just shared and you threw out to me are in such stark contrast to the words we've been given to describe difference and disability. Those words are words like dysmorphic, disordered, abnormal, defective, mutated, retarded, spastic, you know, and they carry a weight, they add a pain and trauma that I think is unnecessary. Because you can't be diagnosed with your identity. And I think if some of these diagnosis words are spoken over a person enough in their life, they start to believe that that's who they are, that something's wrong with them. A diagnosis will shape how you live your life, but it is not who you are. You are so much more than a diagnosis. This was a document that was given to me after Evie was born and we were still living in the hospital, and the doctors really had no idea what was going on. Evie's condition was so rare, it didn't have a name. They called it partial trisomy 9 and partial monosomy 6, which is a deletion and a duplication on 2 of her chromosomes. And so they gave me this piece of paper, and it's awful, right? And I know that there are some medical images out there that you guys must have seen and were terrified by as well. Like it's awful, the things that you find on the internet. And I didn't understand 80% of the words in this document, and the ones I did really, really hurt because it described the things that I loved about Evie and saw so much beauty in such negative detail. So I'm just going to read you the words that I could understand. And I invite you, if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes if you like, and just imagine drawing what you hear me say. This is the only part that I haven't memorized of my speech, because I don't like these words. Anyway, the nose is long, fleshy, slightly beaked. The eyes are deep-seated. The mouth is small and triangular. The chin is small and receding. The ears are relatively large and square with abnormal folding. The neck is short with redundant skin folds. The trunk is asymmetric, the right side being more prominent. The extremities are thin and the fingers and toes unusually long and thin. She has a weak, hoarse cry. The tone is poor. She has stereotypical writhing movements of the arms and legs in an avoidance manner. The main features of this syndrome include mental retardation, microcephaly, a prominent forehead, a prominent nose. Now, on your imaginary piece of paper, have you drawn some very strange-looking creature? Yeah, a very strange-looking creature, right? Would it look anything like a beautiful girl? And like I said, that document described in such negative detail, like her beautiful little sparkly eyes and her little nose. And I remember every single piece of paper that we got from the hospital had a list of the 13 different kind of diagnosis words. And one of them was arachnodactyly. And one day I was like, I'm going to Google that because I don't know what this means. And it turns out it's spider hands, which I guess, makes sense. And I'm terrified of spiders, which is a bit sad now that I live in Australia because there are so many spiders in Australia. But I'm terrified of spiders, and I called Evie's fingers her fairy fingers because they were so long and so delicate. And so I thought, why not? I wonder if anyone would consider changing arachnodactyly to the Latin of fairy fingers, because I think that would be much nicer. But again, the impact of language, it can cause harm, and it gets under your skin, and you're not really aware of it, but you're constantly faced with negative connotations. And so I've been spending the last 7 or 8 years really leaning into this idea of communication because I think it's hard for everybody. It's hard for the clinicians, it's hard for families, especially when you're going through such traumatic moments and emotional times and shock. So how do you communicate in a way that's understood and a way that's kind? And so I've developed this language tool, and I will make sure that you get copies of these slides if you would like, but please feel free to take photographs if it's useful. So I've divided language into these 4 quadrants. We've got the positive and negative axes, and then the jargon and formative axes, and they make these 4 quadrants of language. And so the positive jargon quadrant, that could come across as patronizing or almost like a toxic positivity, where positivity is the only kind of language that's used in a way to avoid feeling all of the other big emotions. And we touched on that a little bit yesterday. Everything needs to be held and safe. And you guys might have experienced this, but in my life with Evie, people would say to me, God only gives special kids to special parents. And while that might sound like a nice thing to say, I wasn't feeling like a special parent. I was feeling exhausted and traumatized and overwhelmed and absolutely desperate. I loved my child so much, but to be labeled a special parent feels like then you can't reach out for help. And it can cause a distance and an alienation. Or you're only given what you can handle. I can see some eye rolls in the room and you think, oh my gosh. Or just stay strong. And I remember thinking, gosh, if someone else tells me to stay strong, I might punch them in the face. You know? Because why do I have to stay strong? It's for somebody else's comfort. Like, you're not allowed to fall apart. Like, this is the thing. So this kind of language brushes over the very big human experiences and doesn't allow you to be honest with yourself and with each other. And it causes barriers to be able to connect with those around you, even your loved ones. I remember after Evie died, people would say to me, she's in a better place now, as if being right with me wasn't the best place for her. So this language is very well-meaning, it's very well-intentioned. People don't go out of their way to intentionally cause this harm, but it is. And then we have this jargon negative quadrant, which is confusing language or clinical language. And I think that if you don't speak medicine, most of the 50,000 or so words that make up the medicine language would just naturally fall into this quadrant, because most people speak regular person language, right? And medicine language is a big thing to learn. It's really big, and you're learning it so fast. And I can imagine a lot of your diagnosis experiences, there were a lot of big words. There were a lot of big words, and you might have felt confused, and then you might have blamed yourself for not understanding. I remember when Evie was still in the hospital, the senior pediatrician had come to tell us Evie's diagnosis and also to tell us that I was a carrier for Evie's particular condition, which was completely new news to me and completely shocking. And so he was basically saying, Rachel, you're okay. You know, your body's like a library. It's full of library books and chapters and words. And in your library, some of the books and the chapters and words are just a bit muddled up. So it's like you've got chapters of Game of Thrones over there and Pride and Prejudice, which would make the craziest book in the history of the world, I think. But, you know, but because all of the words are there, nothing's missing, your brain can unscramble it and you're okay. But Evie, she's got too much Pride and Prejudice and not enough Game of Thrones and a bit missing over there and a bit duplicated there, and so her library is a little bit muddled. So that's how she is. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm barely hanging on here. And I also remember thinking, Rachel, this man is very important. You must not waste his time. You must listen and understand everything he says, or you'll be wasting his time, and that's very bad. And then I just felt my brain kind of go to mush, and you guys might know what that feeling is like, and all of a sudden, all you can hear is wah, wah, wah sounds. And I remember that happening to me, and I thought, oh gosh, oh no, what do I do now? And then I heard 2 words that snapped me back into reality. He said, short arms, and I said, oh, okay, I'm back. I know what those 2 words mean, short arms. And then I was thinking, that's so weird, because Evie's arms look quite perfectly longish to me, and surely the arms are the least of our worries. Aren't they worried about the multiple ventricular septal defect thingies and other things? Why is he going on about these arms? And then I felt my brain go to mush again. And then he was kind of wrapping up his big spiel, and I felt like I just ruined my whole mission, was not accomplished. I didn't understand everything he said. And he's like, have you got any questions? Looking at his watch, walking out the door. And I bravely piped up and I said, yes, I have a question. What are we going to do about Evie's short arms? because that's the only thing that I understood from this big spiel. I was thinking about library books and things and all the rest of it and the arms, and I was like, what on earth? And he looked at me like I was the biggest idiot. And he said, nothing, they're fine, and then walked out the door. And in that moment, I just felt so small and so vulnerable and so stupid and so terrified. And so all of these big feelings is too big to hold. They turn into anger. That's where a fear often goes. When you're so afraid, it can turn into anger. And it turned into this big ball of anger, and I remember thinking, I hate that doctor. He makes me feel stupid. And so to protect myself, every time he came to talk to me and my husband about Evie, I was just like a brick wall. I was just like, yes, yes, understand, yes, What a waste of time. So he was busy sharing all of his wise knowledge that was completely going over my head, completely didn't land. And I think confusion is the thing that can waste so much time and can cause so much damage in healthcare. Because you can't make decisions when you're confused. And you guys are facing decisions on decisions on decisions on decisions. You're always making decisions. And it is so confusing. And how can you make these decisions when you're in the constant state of confusion, or you're not sure, or you feel rushed? Confusion is so damaging, and it is eroding the chance to have positive relationships with healthcare professionals. And then we have this destructive quadrant, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. You know, words like dysmorphic, mutated, abnormal, defective. These words that can attach itself to a person's identity and cause real damage. But look at the shiny yellow quadrant, the empowering quadrant. This is positive, informative language. So it's not that toxic kind of positivity, but at its heart, it's clear and it's kind and it's curious. So it seeks to lean in to another person and ask questions. And the first time I experienced this kind of communication was with a clinical geneticist. So after seeing the guy that I decided I'd hated, we went to see the clinical geneticist. And I remember sitting in his office, and he was a very warm, smiley person. And the first thing he didn't give me a big spiel about all of the big technical things. He said to me, Rachel, what do you know about chromosomes? And I said, look, I couldn't even draw you one. He said, all right, let's start there. So he drew some squiggly little lines. And then within a few seconds, oopsie daisies, I pushed the bad button. Within a few seconds, I was like, oh my gosh, who knew chromosomes had arms? I didn't know until that moment. That's what the other guy was trying to tell me. There's nothing wrong with Evie's arms. I knew it. I knew her arms were fine. They were perfectly longish. But the problem was on the short and the long arm of Evie's chromosomes. Oh my gosh, within 20 seconds, this clinical geneticist had explained something to me that had made me feel so stupid just the day before. And he'd shared this knowledge with me in a way that I understood. And I felt so excited and so empowered and so honored that he would share that with me, and that I could then ask better questions, you know. You can ask better questions when you're not confused, and then the quality of your answers are better, and then people can align what they know better. And it was amazing, and he shared so much information with me, which was just brilliant. And it was just a simple change. So just by asking that question, what do you know about chromosomes, was his way of establishing what is the health literacy of this family in front of me? Where do we need to begin? And like when you're learning a new language, you learn with the ABCs, or you start at the beginning. And so chromosomes for a genetic condition are that very beginning space. And so many of the families that I interviewed and that I've seen and that I work with in the Duchenne community say that these experiences can damage them, that they're often scars that are hard to heal. The diagnosis story can be incredibly traumatic. And I think it's unnecessary. It's a shock, but it doesn't have to have those extra layers of pain. Because your child is still your child, you know, and all of a sudden the focus on their themness, their identity, is almost overtaken completely by the medicine language. I don't love that the family said this, but I think it's powerful. This woman said, I always think of those words and phrases as the scars they've left behind. And so when I think about this kind of communication, again, we're just going to focus quickly on that empowering communication, clear, kind, and curious, and about asking questions. And I think that is the key to everything, because we can't be expected to know what to say or how to say it, and especially when there are religious barriers or social barriers, communication barriers or spiritual barriers. Like, we can't be expected to know how people need to be communicated with. So asking questions can be a really powerful way of connecting with somebody. And so I've made a framework around questions that I think are really useful for families to consider in their own lives, and also for clinicians. And there are these 4 overarching questions. What are you proud of? What do you hope for? What are you afraid of? And what do you need? Now, these 4 questions are almost too big to be useful, because if I was to ask any one of you, what are you afraid of? You'd think, gosh, that's quite personal and it's a bit triggering. So they need to be broken down into smaller pieces. And so I run workshops with healthcare professionals and families that we go into these questions in a little bit more detail. And it's terrible to see. There's so many questions that they're so small on your screen, but there are some beautiful ones in here. These are different ways of asking, what are you proud of? And I think a beautiful example that's in here somewhere is, what matters most? Imagine if a clinician was to ask you and your family what matters most to you, what you would say to them, and then how that might change the direction of the conversations that you're having and the care that you might receive. What do you hope for? And that speaks to quality of life. Everybody has different values, everybody has different dreams, everybody has different visions, and until you ask, you don't know these things. So leaning into some of these questions is really powerful. And what are you afraid of? And I think sometimes, well, actually all the time, I think you're carrying these unspoken, known fears with you around the things that you're afraid of. And so being able to voice those things can be really powerful with your care team as well. And what do you need? There's a beautiful question in here that I love, and it's, what makes your day harder than it needs to be? And I think if you're able to answer that or share that with your care team, would you say things differently than you usually would if they didn't ask you these questions? The thing that I was afraid of most in life happened. Evie died. And it was 15 years ago, a few weeks ago. But this photograph, it was taken about 6 years after Evie died. And this is my favorite photograph in the whole world. I'm scattering her ashes at the base of Aoraki Mount Cook and the beautiful turquoise waters of Lake Pukaki in New Zealand. And I just am in awe of life and the fullness of life and what she taught me and continues to teach me. And I guess after Evie died, I never imagined ever feeling happy again or ever feeling like I could laugh again. But just the power of moments of joy. And we leaned into this a little bit yesterday about how joy is a powerful healer, and you need it to sustain your life. And so I look at this and I consider the beauty and brokenness again, and kind of the full circle of my art school days, finding beauty. And wherever you're at in your life, I hope that you can find that as well, and that you can find these moments and consider our children as our greatest teachers. And it is brutally hard. And you are not alone. I'm going to be around at lunchtime. I'd love to share more with you about your individual stories and sharing things, and I guess feeling confident and courageous to share what you know and your experiences. So there are 10-minute slots if you would love to spend some time with me over lunch. I'd love to spend some time with you talking about your journeys. There's a little sign-up form at the reception desk, so please come and find me. I'll be in there. But thank you so much for the privilege of being with you all and learning from you all. Thank you.